Okay, I think we're probably good to get started. Again, my name's Mark Leggett, Executive Director for Research Data Canada. And today is the third part in our five-part series on data ownership. Today's session is focus in on the Canadian university and college higher ed sector in the context of data ownership. So I'm just going to cover off a couple of what I call housekeeping elements first, and then I'll introduce our facilitator for today. So I suspect everybody on the call is familiar with Zoom these days. That seems to be all that we do is engage in Zoom calls. This is a Zoom webinar, so you'll notice at the bottom of your panel that you should have a Q&A button. So I would strongly encourage you to ask questions, make comments. Jane and I will find a way to insert as many of those as we can into the conversation for today. The Q&A option is a better option because it allows us to respond to them both online and get them off the screen once they're answered, so it makes it easier to make sure we respond to as many as we can. You can use the chat function, but I would suggest using that for if you need any assistance, and I'll do what I can to give you a hand. We're also recording the session. Anybody who signs up or registers for the session will get an email once the video is made available. And you can also see the videos for the previous two sessions. And typically those are available within a couple of days of the webinar itself. So as I said, today is the third in our series. We have a great lineup of folks today that we'll introduce you to. I did want to briefly highlight that our final two sessions, one is the end of November. It's on standards and protocols, in particular those around the concept of ownership, provenance, how do you track research data and indicate ownership using international standards. And then our final session is a focus on open science writ large in the open data context. And again, it'll be a similar type of session. So with that, I would like to introduce you to our facilitator. I'm just going to get rid of my screen share. So I'm very pleased to welcome Jane Burpee, who's a longtime colleague. Jane is currently the Director of Libraries and Learning Centers at Centennial College in Toronto. And Jane's professional experience ranges from librarianship in public college and research university libraries. So she's had a lot of experience in a lot of different contexts in libraries. Before joining Centennial as the director, she was the coordinator of data curation at McGill University. So a good pedigree in the context of today's topic. She has extensive experience guiding the implementation of library spaces and services, leading staff and expertise in providing support in areas ranging from information literacy, scholar communications, and research data management. And we're also lucky to have Jane as a member of our RDC National Data Services Framework Summit. And Jane's been part of that group for a couple of our summits and is continuing with our upcoming one, which will happen next February. So with that, Jane, I will pass it over to you to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Mark, for the introduction, and greetings, everyone, from Toronto. Well, I was born and raised in Montreal, an unceded Indigenous land of the Kanatia Kehaka Mohawk Nation. I want to acknowledge today it is Land Acknowledgement Week in Ontario, and I want to acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat's people. And I acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So I just wanted to start with that. I'm going to start today by introducing our panelists one at a time, and I'll ask each of them to make a short 3 to 4 minute introductory remarks before we get to the real questions today. So first up, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Jeffrey Taylor, the Associate Vice President, Applied Research and Innovation at Nova Scotia Community College, the NSCC. Dr. Taylor joined the NSCC as its Associate Vice President of Applied Research and Innovation in June 2016, where he is privileged to oversee thriving entrepreneurship, research, innovation, international programming, industry engagement, technology assessment centers, and strategic partnership activities at all 20 college locations across Nova Scotia. He sits on the National College Research Advisory Council. He is board member of the Springboard Atlantic, and he is the inaugural board director at the New Data Research Infrastructure Organization. His previous research focused on large satellite data projects at the National Center for Atmospheric Research and helped develop the National Ecological Observatory Network, the first continental scale observatory. He obtained his PhD in physics from the University of Toronto and is a graduate of the National Science Foundation's Leadership Collaboratory Executive Management. He currently serves as a faculty member for the National College of Applied Research Leadership. Over to you, Jeffrey, for some introductory remarks.
Thanks, Jane. That's a lot. It's good to be here, and thanks, Mark, for coordinating these webinars. The first two I found really interesting, so I look forward to contributing to this one. So as Jane said, my name's Jeff Taylor. I work at the Nova Scotia Community College. We're the only public college in Nova Scotia, so we have locations everywhere from Yarmouth to Sydney, and today I'm speaking to you from our central office in the north end of Halifax. Halifax is known in the traditional Mi'kmaq language as Jubuktuk, if I'm saying that correctly, refers to essentially deep water. And for those of you that haven't been to Halifax before, I invite you to come visit. There's a great big harbor here right next to me that certainly bears the name Jubuktuk. And speaking to you not just from Jubuktuk, but from Mi'kma'ki, the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, we have a saying in Nova Scotia, we're all treaty people. There was a treaty in the 1750s that brought us all together, and we all still are bound under it. So it's great to be here and chat with you. I won't speak too much in terms of personal introduction, more just kind of a background and perspective I bring. As Jane mentioned, I'm at NSCC. I never went to school through the college system. I never worked at a college. I spent years at universities. I worked at U of T and Waterloo, and then at universities and research organizations in the US. So I have a fair bit of perspective on data management from the university side, and was quite pleasantly surprised in a way in the college side and how things are managed differently here. I think we'll have a full hour to discuss the pros and cons, I guess, of these things. And one thing that I found fascinating is the kind of cultural attitude towards data and how that's managed in the post-secondary jurisdiction, and I'm sure Mark and I will have a good debate about that. So I'll stop now and look forward to discussing the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Sorry, not Mark, I mean Jeffrey. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Joseph Daley. Dr. Daley is the Vice President Research at CFAR and a professor of computer science, biology, epidemiology, and biostatistics, electrical and computer engineering, applied mathematics, and statistics and actuarial science at Western University. Dr. Daley chairs the board of Compute Ontario and serves on the Ontario Research Fund Advisory Board and the board of directors at ISIS. He was co-founder of CanCOVID, an expert network of Canadian COVID-19 researchers, clinical collaboratories, and healthcare professionals. He served as Associate Vice President for Research of Western University from 2015 to 2019, and in 2019 was appointed Western University's Special Advisor to the President on Data Strategy. Mark, have you got some introductory words to share?
Thank you, Jane. I'm speaking to you from London, Ontario, where I'm on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Lenni Lenape peoples. Research data ownership is complex, And I think that's going to be my theme for today. And I'm going to pick on one of my home disciplines because it's easier to criticize yourself. The complexity isn't just saying a humanist may have a different approach than a mechanical engineer. Even within computer science, we can take closely related subfields. So I look at computer graphics, and the culture in computer graphics is no data, no code is ever shared. And this grew out of the 1990s, where if you had a paper in SIGGRAPH, Disney was probably licensing it, or Pixar was trying to recruit you. And so there was this really strong commercialization element. And so the literature is full of irreproducible results because all you get is the picture, and here's a story, but not enough that you can implement the same picture. In machine learning, the culture has traditionally been extremely open. And most of the big deep learning conferences now, papers are mandatorily posted on the archive as they go for review. And so the culture is very open. Data must be shared, code must be shared. But even there, OpenAI, which is kind of ironically named, founded to produce OpenAI research, have recently released their GPT-3 model, which is an impressive feat in natural language processing, but it is of course completely non-open and only available by a subscription service. So even where you think there's a disciplinary consensus around how we share research data and research results, that can change overnight when commercialization becomes a force.
Thank you, Mark. That's really interesting to think about that shift that we've all kind of walked through from commercialization to that open data sharing culture. All right, so over to question number 1. I thought I would start by asking, what is the traditional understanding or milieu for the ownership of research data in higher education context, both from an administrative or faculty contracts and then as a cultural perspective? Jeffrey?
Yeah, so I feel like I'm still learning the different cultural perspectives every day. It's vast. I will tell you from my field, kind of going with Mark's theme, I worked in atmospheric physics and meteorology for years, a strong culture of sharing data, always. You couldn't predict the weather if you didn't share the data from all over. There's a joke, in the Cold War, the Russians and the Americans shared their weather data just so they could understand how to predict. So I came from this space where everyone shared data. It was open, it was posted immediately, NASA obliged it, it was understood. And I went and started this new organization that helped start this new organization that was focused on climate observing across the continent. And it involved a lot of impacts. So that means ecologists, people that collect bugs and look at leaves and how species are changing with climate impacts. And these people not only did they not share data, they collected specimens and stored them in their desk drawer for 10 years before they looked at them. And then they might talk about sharing the data. So it was a very guarded kind of place that they come from. And if we expand that and then move over into the arts and literature community, the question of what is data becomes this whole different kind of thing. So the cultural traditions at a post-secondary institution are just all over the map. And it's probably one of the biggest challenges for the next generation is how to fit that into a box. And I think we don't want to fit anything into a box, of course, but I think the notion of just data management being part of everyone's plan, however it might be for your discipline, for your needs, for your culture, is an important challenge for us to wrestle with here in the next decade.
Fascinating. Mark?
Nothing to disagree with there. It's back to the theme of almost unbounded complexity, and the only really worthwhile consensus I've been able to pull out of this, and this is after many years of working in this space, is that there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. At the same time, it's really hard to have an individual solution for each faculty member, which is what, as a faculty member, I'd like, and I'm sure what my colleagues would like too, but that's not especially tenable without some real thought to the mechanisms at play. And so I don't think there are any easy or fast solutions. And it seems to be getting more challenging with each passing day. Again, because it's not just about the interdisciplinary differences and the cultural differences across our disciplines, but all of the external forces too. So, you know, if I'm interested in giving policy advice to multilateral organizations and global governments, then I want to push my data out. And in fact, my problem isn't that I don't want to make my data open. It's that I can't make it open enough fast enough. But if I want to create a startup company based on the IP that I've just generated, I may not want to share that data straight away. Even though if I'd shared that data, that may start a whole cluster of industry in my local region or my country. So unbridled complexity.
Yeah, I kind of wonder if the incentive system we have in place and the traditional incentives that we probably kind of grew up with were publications, right? More publications, more citations, the better.
And grant dollars.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's not changing. That's a present. But you know, we moved to data publication, data citations, DOIs. Like we're getting there with recognizing the value of data, and the more discoverable and open you make it, I think the more value people have. And I think there could be, to your point, Mark, it's not one size fits all, but having those tools or those opportunities to kind of enable incentives be in different spaces might be a good way to kind of bring people along.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think getting back to that matter of incentives. So we've both been AVPRs, and in our world, we want to tell people, yes, get out there, share your data. That'll mean higher impact for your publications. But when we're wearing our professorial hats and there's promotion and tenure committees, it still comes back to, you know, well, what was the author order on that paper and how many citations and how good was that journal anyways? And people who have put a huge amount of effort into things like creating and curating databases, which is critical for modern science, that's still largely not valued on P&T committees. So there does need to be a culture shift. It's starting, but we have to be active supporters of this culture shift in the academy, that someone who has taken time and instead of writing their 7th paper of the year and only having 6 papers and spending a bunch of time curating this database, that actually did far more for humanity than one more paper on sort of the same topic.
Yeah, and some of the challenges you get, and they're great questions. I had a faculty member in here, a researcher, and he said, so let me get this straight. I'm going to write the proposal. I'm going to build all the partnerships. I'm going to mentor all the students. I'm going to collect all the data, do all the field work, get everything, you know, organized and curated. And then I'm just going to give it all away. And you think that's going to help me kind of be successful? And, you know, I understand the sentiment that he's bringing to the conversation. It is different. It's you let it out there, let it grow is kind of what we want to kind of promote in our institutions. And you can kind of point to these open data advances in Europe and stuff that came out after they put certain policies in place and the economic growth and the money savings. But when it comes to an individual faculty member trying to connect to that, it's going to be a tough sell for quite a while, I think.
Agreed.
I was even chatting last night. My spouse is a medical researcher, a physician, clinician investigator, and she said, that grad student's not been looking at the data lately, so I think I'm just going to remove her access. And I said, are you worried she might corrupt the database or modify it? And she said, no, I'm not comfortable having the data be that accessible. And I couldn't get her to articulate why, but that's kind of a sentiment that many of us have in the back of our mind. And getting comfortable with open data, it's a new world.
Can you imagine a world if we didn't have access to all the COVID-19 dashboards that every city and every province and country has right now? I mean, we're all clutched on it, I think, not just the data scientists.
Or US electoral data.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, good examples. So we just have to keep pushing out those examples that are so powerful in how important it is to have that live, you know, data connection. Yeah. And I'm really interested in your thoughts, both of you, because of where you sit in terms of leadership, in terms of the administrative side of leading this cultural shift. while we have all the cultural disciplinary differences, there's also the administrative leadership that's so incredibly important to who owns the research data. And I imagine that in a community college, it might be a little different than at the university sector.
Yeah, maybe I'll comment first, then, and I'll speak as a college person, and Mark can contrast. And I expect probably the majority of attendees are from the university sector. So I'll discuss it from a college's perspective, and I think I can speak on behalf of almost all colleges in Canada. The research mission is not discovery or curiosity-driven kind of traditional PI-led research. It's institutional research, and it's really focused on economic or social benefit. So, I had a friend in grad school. He was one of the world's foremost experts on love poetry during the Crimean War. And he wouldn't be able to get a job at this college doing that because that's not a key strategic sector of growth for the Nova Scotia economy. And so we're focused much more on concrete outcomes that will benefit kind of Nova Scotians, just as other colleges would be focused on their local kind of needs. And with that in mind, we don't want any of the intellectual property that's generated at the end of a research project or any of the data. Now, we want the data to be discoverable and accessible and all of the good things that we're all trying to achieve, but there's no sense of data ownership present. I say that with a caveat because there are some individuals who certainly do have that sense of ownership, but the college policy position, the administrative leadership position is we don't want to own that. We want that to be out there for everyone to access. I find that kind of refreshing from the university context where, every job I had, I signed that IP policy like on day one. It was here's how it works. Anything you create is ours to commercialize, and it sort of goes out the door. And this is much more freeing because we're helping partners that commercialize and social community organizations that benefit really bring things to life. I'd say that the frontier, the challenge that we're facing is, what if you create something of great value, really good data set, you give it to that industry partner and they don't do anything with it. They sit on it, they own it, and then it doesn't get to kind of benefit the ecosystem in the way that you imagine. That's probably where we're rubbing up against things right now.
Good point. Did you want to add to that, Mark?
Yeah, sure. The university context is of course hugely diverse, and especially if you start going further afield than North America and looking into European institutions, where in a lot of countries in Europe it looks much more like what Jeff just described in the college sector. There's a real sense of work for hire. As a professor, you're an employee and you're doing work for hire for the organization. The North American sort of Johns Hopkins derived model is, yes, the PI is the CEO of their own lab, which has advantages and disadvantages. As PI of my own lab, I think it's great. When I was sitting in Jeff's chair, it was sometimes challenging. But if you look at modern Canadian institutions, over the last, I would say, 2 or 3 decades, some of the thought leaders, and I'm going to give credit to Waterloo here for really being out front with thoughtful IP policy that has influenced a lot of other organizations, including Western. So Western's IP policy is inventor owned. Yeah. If you as a researcher invent something, that's yours. If you as a graduate student invent something, that's yours. And then you have a choice of how you want to choose to commercialize that. So in my own lab, there have been, inventions that we have chosen to pursue patents with the university, and so that then there's co-ownership of that, because the agreement is they will pay for all of the legal costs up front, and then they get a slice of any revenue that's generated. And we all know, and Jeff's going to laugh, most patents never generate any revenue, so this is a pretty good deal. You take the upfront costs, and I will take a fraction of licensing fees. But there's been a couple of times where we've done a spin-off and chosen to pursue commercialization on our own, and that's supported by the organization. And I do think Waterloo was a real thought leader on that decades ago, setting that as a sort of gold standard IP model. And then that goes through to data as well. Data is just one form of intellectual property. And what we've been doing at Western, and what most of the U15s and other research-intensive universities in Canada are actively promoting open science. So we can't force our professoriate, nor should we, to make everything open. But what we can do is educate, encourage, and promote, and provide incentives. So we had funds set aside when I was AVPR for promoting research opportunities where the PI would specifically engage with open science philosophy and framework and commit to following. And there's a few to pick from, but we were pretty flexible on which one you picked, as long as they had the same sort of core values underneath. And I think we need to do more of that. And that's really the only way culture ever changes. It is encouraging one person at a time to try something different.
Jane, I'm not sure if you can see the Q&A, but one of our listeners put in the Waterloo IP policy, which is if you create it, you own it, period.
Yep.
And there's a
They're
link.
known for that, aren't they? They're really
Yeah.
known for that. There's a few big companies that have come out of Waterloo through that IP policy.
And the rest of us are paying attention to that.
Yeah. Mark's given me a couple of questions, and I want to just ask you the third question that he proposed. And I'm wondering if you could just kind of weigh it a little bit and be a bit devil's advocate here. But do you think innovation and discovery would be better served by increasing the research or institutional or partner control of data, or by increasing open data sharing? Maybe obvious, but let's try to break that apart a little bit.
If I go first, then I'll pick the side of open data sharing, because that's what I think I can argue for better. Obviously, that's the future of the world. Like, we can't sit on data. No one's gonna learn from hidden data. I think there's that cultural sense of ownership. That's really the barrier there. But innovation and discovery is served so much better. I saw an infographic from the EU that kind of looked at benefits downstream from their open data policy, and the amount of time that individuals save not looking for parking spaces is so much a year, just because that data is open and accessible, and there's someone's app that is able to tell you where to park. I mean, the innovation is served by having that whole blanket of open data. And I wouldn't say it's just a researcher institution, but there's government agencies try to sell you data. I remember when my wife was pregnant with my daughter and we got the ultrasound done, I couldn't take a picture of the ultrasound, but if I spent $20, they would give me a CD with an image of the ultrasound on it. And I felt confident that was my intellectual property, and they should not be trying to sell me a data product based on it. But it's kind of pervasive in our culture, this trying to monetize data. And there's nothing wrong with being innovative and entrepreneurial and trying to make great outcomes because of that data. But the openness of it will promote more of an innovative spirit than the closed nature of it. Now, Mark, you have to argue for why it should be.
And I want to just throw something in there first in between, because I always wonder about things like security and risk, and are we giving up too much data? How do we ensure that that is protected?
Yeah, great question. I'll give you an example. From meteorology, back in the early days of satellite meteorology, where you could observe weather in other countries, these satellites would publish data on the growing conditions in certain countries, and then the investments in the futures of those crops would be impacted and go down. And so then countries caught on and said, you know what, we can't let this bad data get out there. Our economy is going to get hit. So let's falsify our climate data so that we're able to ensure we get better investment. And then you have just noise, right? So that's not even a security risk. It's just almost a misinformation kind of risk. And if we think of where we are, US election and alternative facts and everything else, there's a lot of misinformation out there. So filtration and curation might become the next big frontier. If data becomes open, how do we digest it and sort it is a real big question.
What do you think, Mark?
Okay, so I'm being forced to take a position that I don't actually believe in, but I will try. But it hurts my soul because I'm an open data person right down to the core. Challenge with opening data. So you're absolutely correct that if there's a critical mass of usable open data sets, that spurs innovation. but it also commoditizes innovation because now everyone's got access to that same data set. And so now my parking app really isn't innovative. I'm just competing on how good my marketing team is versus your marketing team. And that's fine, but that only scales so far. You know, you can only have so many parking apps in the marketplace before adding another one doesn't really add any economic value. And so if I'm a corporation that's really looking for scale, if I want to be the next Google, I want to be the next Facebook, the only real competitive advantage I have that's worth mentioning is my data, right? Saying I should open my data would be like telling Standard Oil in the 1920s, you should open your oil fields, and anyone who wants should just be able to pipe in. Those companies, you know, there's 6 companies that control some ridiculous proportion of the market capitalization of the New York Stock Exchange, and they're all based on data and monetizing that data. And so OpenAI, I mentioned earlier, is an example of a company where initially they committed to openness, and then as soon as the economic viability equation flipped, like no, now we're keeping this closed, and so there's this balance back and forth. Jane, you raised the point of security, and I think I can tie that into potentially a solution here. That security and risk piece is absolutely critical in the context of PHI, personalized health information. And I do research with PHI, and there are a lot of really strict rules around how and when that can be used and by whom it can be accessed and what you can do with it, as there ought to be. But that's sort of one of the most tightly regulated and controlled types of data. And so I have 2 things that are in opposition. On the one hand, if I had access to every medical record of every resident of Ontario, I am positive there are latent insights in there that would allow me to adopt new public health policy, new medical procedures, new prescribing procedures that would ameliorate the suffering of many, many humans. On the other hand, as an individual human who's in that data set, do I want any researcher in the world who says, yeah, I'd like access to know everything about my medical history, including my insurance company? No. So how do you balance that tension? And Jeff mentioned the futures market, right? In the context of using GIS data to trade futures. I think markets might actually work. There's a growing consensus amongst economists who study data, and data being a really spectacular and interesting example of a public good. What if we make data available on a market? And so the idea is that I, as a researcher, would have to pay a market price to get access to this many individuals' medical records for my study. And as an individual, I have a choice. My phone pops up a notification and says, this researcher would like to use your data for this purpose. If you click yes, I'll give you $2.50. And so I've monetized it. There's a transaction there. It's a contract with consideration, and I'm being compensated. I'm taking a risk by allowing you to use my data, and you are giving me financial compensation in exchange for the risk I've taken. Most likely, I would probably have a broker. So now I'm creating a whole new economy who made those decisions for me. I'd say, here's my risk threshold. Just send me a check at the end of the month. It's not perfect, but it does fit in with a capitalist market-driven society that we live in.
Yeah, let's start with Facebook and TikTok. Probably $1 million. I love it.
That's fascinating. When I was a grad student in Toronto, Mark, and was really poor, I volunteered to do a DRDC Defense Canada, be a guinea pig. And I signed some waiver, and they gave me a bunch of money, and it was horrible. So I feel like there's some hidden risks here to the, sure, I'll sell my data and see what happens, but I'm still recovering from that experience.
So to be clear, what I like about the market-driven model isn't necessarily the flow of capital. That's a side effect. It's empowering me as an individual to choose how my data is used, and including allowing me to offload that decision to a proxy. but it's ultimately up to me. I am empowered to control the use of my data, and I can say no to everything if I want to. And I do like that.
I guess that's why we sign an ethics waiver, right? That's what we're signing away when there is research that's taking place about ourselves.
Yep.
Yeah. But in terms of innovation and discovery, I think we all seem to agree that the control of data might not be the best route. We need to increase open data sharing, despite risks and concerns that we might have about security.
If you're trying to optimize human welfare, there's no question that the greater the openness and the greater the amount of data, the more likely it will be that we can make the world better.
Yeah. I guess what I hear from people is, if it gets into the hands of the wrong guys, they will manipulate it. So how do we ensure that does not happen? It's going to be the big challenge, I think, of our future research community. We're not all on the good side, right? All right, I have another question for you. I don't know, unless there's anything in the chat, Mark, that you want to bring up.
Well, we've got a few things in the Q&A and a couple of, so one, just coming back to some great comments, but one of the questions is, are you okay with anonymous access to open data, or should users need to register or authenticate? And the listener puts it in the context that they're not a data distributor, but they want to be able to notify the data provider where their data is used, but also notify the users of the data when something in their download is updated or even withdrawn. So that's, I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that one.
I don't know where it fits, well, I understand the sentiment. If you're a researcher, when someone cites my paper, I get an alert and I know exactly who's talking about kind of my intellectual kind of capital, but we consume data all around us all the time, every day. And, I don't register as a user to read the headline on the news or whatever that I walk by. So I don't know where the boundary comes for that. At what point do you need to register and say, I'm going to use this data, now I'm using it, versus it's somehow in the public domain, and it becomes real blurry for me in that space. And as we go to open data, then that whole thing just becomes a smeared out area.
I agree entirely. There's a boundary, and the answer to that question is it's a spectrum. So if it's my PHI, then yes, I want to make sure that you know to whom you're giving it, and that if I choose, post hoc to withdraw access to my PHI, I'm entitled to. That's sort of a fundamental ethical principle, at least in the Canadian space, that I can choose to withdraw at any time. And so you need to be able to contact people. And if there's something wrong with the data set, then likewise, you need to be able to inform those who have downloaded it. But that implies a really high duty of curation.
Yeah.
And not every data set is going to have that. There's going to be data sets like the temperatures in the Ivory Coast, and that's going to affect the cocoa futures, but that probably no one is going to commit to curating that and updating it. And so it comes back to that spectrum of risk and where the particular data set falls on that.
It's kind of like you get what you pay for. Sure, here's some free data. Good luck.
Yeah, right.
And then the only one, and I'll let you ask the next question, Jane, the only other one I would insert, because it's related to Mark and Jeff's previous conversation about the kind of market-driven approach or commercialization versus the open piece. And the question is, who among us, government, academics, oversight boards, consisting of users, who should be empowered to prevent another kind of Cambridge Analytics fiasco based on the commercialization of data?
All of the above.
Yeah, this is like a regulatory question or like an ethical. We're all empowered, I guess, to prevent that from happening.
So I think we, the electorate, have to demand better from our regulators, and our regulators have to demand better from our corporations. What Cambridge Analytica made extremely clear is that where there's a attractive enough profit motive, there's little that can stand in the way of that other than regulation and enforcement. And right now, Western democracies, by and large, are simply failing to take the threat seriously enough. The technology has moved faster than legislation can keep up. And we live in a common law tradition where law moves slowly, which is generally a good thing, but in this case has left us with a real serious liability. And like, honestly, this is something I lose sleep over.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I think was a great kind of thing to think about is there will always be bad actors, right? And how do we guard ourselves against bad actors in the space of open data? Jane kind of posed that challenge to us, and there's innovation both on the kind of great research side and on the bad actor side. So you kind of need to be diligent regardless.
I guess that's something that I think about, right? So that I for many years I was such an optimist and very innocent and naive with very big rose-colored glasses, and a number of my colleagues in the library world sort of poked me and made me sort of open up and think about this. And certainly in the last few years, there's been a lot on the global scene to make us think about it more seriously, that we really do need to make sure that we have the checks and balances in place, don't we? And I guess from the university or the higher ed, it comes from our senior leadership, for sure. So if we had one opportunity to facilitate a broad cultural change in the ownership, sharing of research data, what do you think would be the most effective action?
One change.
Sure, if you want to do two, that's okay.
Yeah, I guess that notion maybe of publishing data or some incentive that has everyone agree that this is commonly of value to have open data is what it would be. And Mark has pitched all kinds of ideas, the marketplace kind of for having this data be available, or but in the context of tenure review, for example, and the kind of traditional post-secondary assessment of progress and a professional aptitude, we need to have kind of open data become part of that conversation.
I agree 100%. Sorry, I'm not going to give you conflict here. The only thing that works, I think more broadly, but certainly in the academy, is changing the incentive structures. Yeah. And so if we create incentives that promote a shift in our values. So, our core values as academics are, we generate knowledge and share it. We publish papers. We don't get paid to publish those papers. In fact, we often pay open access fees because that's a moral imperative for us, is to share our knowledge. And it's not a big stretch to say sharing the data that helped you create that knowledge is just part of it. So if we could, through incentives, shift the values of the academy, I think that would be a global win.
And I don't, to Mark's point, we're getting there, right? When you publish your Nature paper, there's a link to the data that went into that paper. So there's already the kind of extrinsic factors promoting that kind of shift in values. It might take a generation. Academia doesn't evolve quickly. It might take some time to adopt, but I'm optimistic we'll get there. I'm still wearing the rose-colored glasses, Jane. I think it's
I'm with you. And if you look at, there are disciplines, I'm going to call it the observational astronomers here, who are 30 years ahead of the rest of us and have been doing open data perfectly for decades. You get time on the Hubble Space Telescope. NASA tells you get your 6-month proprietary period, and then anyone in the world who wants it can download it.
Yeah. The only one I would add to this, and this is again that college context, I'd almost want to have an incentive for an industry or community partner that says, if you guys don't share your data appropriately or do something with it in an embargoed time period, we're going to make it public. So as of this date, it's going out the door. And that's kind of a harsh, kind of heavy-handed approach, but it might help us get to that open data space.
That seems to be one of the big challenges in the college sector, because we do work with industry partners so heavily in terms of research, getting our students engaged in research. So how do we bring them along so they're not commercializing the research that gets conducted in the college sector?
Yeah, and I think the previous two webinars, I don't want to harken back to the past too much, but they kind of wrestled with this too. And it's a topic we're all going to be struggling with for years to come.
Because we do want commercialization and innovation. So we've got to find that balance between, there's got to be social good here, and there has to be economic value to our corporate partners.
And it's a blurry line, like we said, and individuals assess the social good in different ways. So, and then bad actors. So yeah, noisy.
So Jane, we have a, so that's a great conversation on that kind of
Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to you to ask a couple more questions from the Q&A.
tough question. Yeah, maybe I'll just throw these out and anybody can kind of pipe in here. I'm going to combine two of them together because they're both kind of related to this incentives piece and in a sense the policy piece. So one question is on the incentive side, would a tri-council policy help? And then a kind of a related question in the context of inventor-owned data policies like the Waterloo one that was mentioned. How can that be reconciled with grant requirements for data openness accessibility like the emerging tri-council policy? Whose interests take precedent, that personal interest or the public?
Yeah, that's so maybe I can comment on when I worked in the States. So I would say the States was maybe 5 years ahead of Canada in terms of that pushing the open data and it being a obligation of your grant funding. You know, every grant proposal I wrote had to have a research data management plan attached to it. And at first, when it was first obliged, you can imagine it was just a few sentences, and I'm going to host it on the website or something. It was very, very unsophisticated, but it's getting more and more in there. They've gone to a data.gov kind of approach where that data is going to be hosted by the government somehow and accessible by everyone. And so it kind of, it's kind of almost taking it out of the PI's hands and saying, you know what, we know you're maybe not in agreement with this, and maybe you don't have the skill set or a great librarian like Jane to help you. So we're gonna put it up here, and everyone's gonna find it that way. And so it kind of it kind of shifted the burden in a way. But the inventor-owned stuff and what you get to keep and try to innovate and monetize and do things with, I think that's just an embargo period thing. Like I think you just give people a clock and you say you can do stuff in this period of time. You can publish your papers. You can work with commercial partners. We'll try to start a business, but this data is not going to remain hidden forever. And you kind of set a timeline.
Exactly. So you know we look to the Tri-Council to create rules and guidelines, and I know they are actively working on this that are consistent with the outcomes we want to achieve. So if we're talking about an NSERC discovery grant, then the open data policy may look different than if we're talking about an alliance grant with a corporate partner. And there needs to be more flexibility in the latter, because the latter is investing capital into the project and they want to retain some ownership of what comes out. And I think that's organically already happening to a great deal in the organization. So Waterloo's IP policy, which is the same as Western's, want to give Western credit too. You know, I own my IP that I create. If I choose to make it open, that's great. If I choose to license it to a corporate partner, that's also something that I'm empowered to do. So, you know, that sense of ownership is about empowerment. It's not saying you and only you ever own this.
That's great. Interesting question here, and I suspect Jeff may want to jump in on this one first, although Mark as well. Is there a role for Endrio, the new DRI organization that's getting itself underway, in helping universities and colleges to develop tools to help with data, whether it's, you know, with metadata schemas or algorithms or machine readable governance structures for each data set, that kind of stuff, a Canadian open science framework. Can that help the PI? You know, so what's the role of Endrio in this context?
Yeah, so I'm on Endrio's board, and I think the fast answer is yes, definitely Endrio should help with this. I'll give you the analogy I saw in the US, and that was an organization called Data One. So when the National Science Foundation in the US said everyone's got to make their data, you know, discoverable and open, everything, this organization Data One popped up and said, we'll help you do it. Researcher X, Y, and Z, partner with us, and we'll make sure it gets out there. And I can see Endrio having a role similar to that, or in that space, enabling that to happen. The question about schema and details, I don't have any details for you what that'll look like. Endrio is so new, and thankfully we just hired the CEO, Nizar Ladek from Compute Ontario, just started last month. So he's
stolen, not hired.
sensitive to this particular topic, apparently. This is our first real
Very,
debate.
very happy to see him move on.
Yeah, he's excellent. And like I said, just started, but he'll be the kind of voice you'll be looking for guidance in this space in the near future. And I think the really good news is when Embryo was conceived, it was really important to have a stakeholder group, a researcher council be an essential part of it. And that inaugural researcher council was just announced kind of end of summer, early fall. It was a rushed appointment because we wanted to make sure that voice was heard first. And that'll ensure that all of the listeners, I hope, have a voice there at that stakeholder table to ensure Embryo doesn't go down some weird pathways or rabbit holes. It's so crucial that we hear everyone speak about their needs in this space. And the last thing I'll say about Embryo before Mark mentions something is that researcher council, although it was rushed, there will be opportunities to join. It will kind of be an evolving body. And I was impressed by the EDI focus that was really put on recruitment and ensuring there is a really good representation of Canada's interests from various equity seeking groups and communities. So I'm really optimistic, and I'm not just saying that because I'm a board member, but I think Andrew is really going to help us in this space.
I'll just add that Compute Ontario is fully aligned with the vision Embryo has, and we want to help you build and succeed. And the fact that, you know, we across time we've shared a CEO brings the organizations close together too.
Yeah, it's excellent.
There's a couple of other comments there. One of them is a helpful comment, just highlighting that SSHRC does currently have a policy for a specific grant context that does require data to be made public within 2 years of the completion of the research project. And there is a link there. So that's there for people's interest. And maybe just might try and kind of combine these last two questions and then we can wrap up, Jane. So one is, if IP is developed under a public grants process or funding envelope, does the public retain any ownership or interest in the products or the outputs? So that's one question. And then the final one is quite different, but I'm going to get them both out. Would an open data world open us up, not thinking of any particular recent events, open us up to a larger potential for fake data being released for personal gain or profit? So you can either one of those or both, and then I'm done.
I think a good exemplar of the first case. I mean, for sure, as a taxpayer, if taxpayer funds, you know, national funds have been used to support research, I feel like now as a taxpayer, I have a vested interest in owning some of the outcome of that. But if you take that to an extreme, you get the IP policy that the NRC had for many years, where if you collaborated with the NRC on anything, Crown copyright applied and Crown ownership, and the government owned everything and you own nothing. And that stifled a lot of innovation. It made it hard to work with academics and with corporate partners. And so that policy evolved to acknowledge that absolutes are tough in this domain and you really do need some level of fluidity.
Yeah, I think that'd be common across most funding. The last, I'll try to answer Mark's last question there, and I think it's a quick answer. I think the answer is yes. So would open data kind of open a world for us to be at risk of fake data being used for personal gain or profit? And I'd say yes, that's definitely a risk that's going to be out there in the world of open data. It's probably out there now, right, as we try to navigate things.
Yeah, I don't think that's a future risk. I think that's happening right now.
And the comment on SSHRC, all of the tri-councils are certainly pushing data management plans, and institutions like Mark's and mine have to come up with a strategy for data management. And then there's an institutional kind of plan that each researcher will need to adhere to make their data discoverable. It's kind of gone soft, and I've got a meeting about it tomorrow, actually. And I think well-intended, I appreciate what the tri-council's trying to do. They kind of went quiet during COVID, and they're trying to let everyone kind of cope with the current landscape, and they don't want to push these deadlines too hard on people. So I expect we'll hear more about that again soon. They're kind of consulting now on how maybe they should start the clock on that and when they can expect institutions to kind of become adherent to that new policy. I think there's a common question about cost. Who's going to pay for all this? That's always a question that comes up, but it'll help us get to open data at the end of the day.
Over to you, Jane, for, I don't know how you want to do closers. It's up to you.
Well, I just want to thank both of you, Jeffrey and Mark. This was a fascinating and stimulating panel with very few questions, but you had lots to make us think about, and I really appreciate that you gave us your time today to talk about the issues. And to the other Mark, Mark, thank you so much for organizing today. Research Data Canada is like a very important organization for all of us here in Canada. And I just appreciate your leadership in bringing this forward so that we can all move our own skills and awareness and agendas forward. So thank you so much, Mark, for today.
Thanks, Jane. And just I'll let Jeff and Mark have any final comments, but I did want to thank all three of you. We kind of planned this 5-part data series a while ago. And then the plans, as they always do, it changed a bit as the details move forward. But I've been getting a lot of great feedback from the community, and this webinar series has been our most popular and the highest number of attendees. So I think that highlights that this question is an important one, and that people are engaged in the conversation. So I just want to thank the three of you for what was a very engaging and important conversation. And I don't know, Jeff or Mark, if either one of you wants to have any final comments.
No, just words of appreciation. I had a good time talking with this. This is the best meeting I've had all day. Thank you for organizing this, Mark. Our debate was quite friendly and stimulating. So I look forward to seeing the rest of the seminars. I'm so glad that I could contribute.
I'll echo that. Highlight of the day for sure. Mark, thank you for bringing us together. Jane, thank you for facilitating so aptly. And Jeffrey, thank you for great conversation. So at some Indrio board meeting in the future, we should chat over drinks.
Definitely, Mark. If we can come to Halifax, it'll be a good time.
And to all our participants today, in the great words of Dr. Jeffrey Taylor, let it out, let it grow.
That's a great way to end it. And thanks again to the three of you, and thanks to all who signed in today. And as a reminder, we will send out an email to everybody who registered as soon as the video is available so that you can share it with your colleagues. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Everyone.